Hi, this is Miss Klemme. Welcome to the podcast on an introduction to the immune system. And what you're looking at here are a series of pictures of young children, perhaps in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, who had been ravaged by the polio virus. And polio virus caused either temporary or permanent paralysis. And this disease just ravaged the country. Thousands were affected at one time, and so much so that entire hospital wards will be filled with these kids in iron lungs. And here's a picture of that. Here's another where nurses were just dedicated to treating those who had been infected with the polio virus, and it caused paralysis of their diaphragm, and so they couldn't breathe. And unfortunately, we didn't have heart-lung machines to keep ourselves breathing, and so that was the only option. But thankfully, all this bad news turned pretty good because there was a vaccine that was developed, and ever since the early to mid 90s, the Americas, North and South, have been polio-free. Europe was about a decade or so later, and so even though it's a really sad start to the story, overall it's been a happy ending, especially with this particular virus. But before we can actually go and take a look at how our immune system defends against viruses and other things, I need to give you some background information on the topic. So, the first and most simple question we can ask is, why do we actually need an immune system? Well, there's two kinds of attack coming at us at all times. There's attack from the outside, and there are attacks from internally within us. There are lots of organisms who love to eat all those wonderful, fantastic, nutrient-filled things inside of us, and so we always have to make sure that we have defenses up against viruses like the HIV or SARS or influenza, or bacteria which could cause meningitis or tuberculosis, fungi, yeast infections, athlete's foot, even protists, Lyme's disease or malaria. So we have all these invaders always wanting to get in, but we've also got to look internally. Abnormal body cells, when they divide, could become cancerous, or for some idiopathic reason, there could be parts of our body that start to attack itself in autoimmune disorders. So there's a lot of attack that's continually happening, and we have to be always ready for it. And so we have lots of different layers of defense depending on how far those invaders actually infiltrate our system. And so what I'm going to show you are the different layers of defense. And the first line of defense is what we like to call non-specific. It's just there. It's not protecting against a particular pathogen. It's just going to block anything it can. And so I like to think of this dotted line across the whole circle here as our skin. It's a great first line of defense, keeps out a lot of pathogens. But sometimes pathogens can get in us, and so we have chemicals in our body like the hydrochloric acid in our stomachs with a low pH, and even our tears, which have a slightly lower pH to help kill off any invaders that may get that far into our bodies. And so that's just the first line of defense, non-specific. The second line of defense, also non-specific, which again means that they're not attacking a particular pathogen, but things like a fever would be non-specific. It's a whole body raising up the thermostat a few degrees in hopes to slow down bacteria growth or viral replication so that our bodies can actually catch up. But the other one I want to bring to your attention is this phagocytosis, done by a specific type of white blood cell. I'll show you a picture of them coming up. But essentially, they just keep roaming around your body, and so I tend to think of those white blood cells here. And I'll show you how they actually help out our bodies on the next slide. But if we get farther into the interior, so something has infiltrated through the first line, through the second line. What's left is the third line of defense. And at this point, we've really got to turn up the intensity. And so we turn to something called specific immunity, which is a specific attack against a specific pathogen. It's no longer just anything goes. We have a specific strategic plan in place. And so there are two types of specific immunity. There's humoral immunity, and this just means that the pathogen is just kind of floating around in the body fluids. And so humoral means in fluid. Cell-mediated immunity is when that pathogen is actually infiltrated the cell itself. So it's actually within a cell in our bodies. And there are different approaches depending on where that pathogen is. If it's just simply a microbe floating around in our interstitial fluid, we'll go the humoral route. If it's cell-mediated, if it's already inside the cell like a virus, we have to do other routes and other mechanisms. So those are our three lines of defense. Again, the first two are nonspecific, and the third is very particular and very specific. But what I want to do is I want to go back to this one, these white blood cells. And they do have a name. They're called macrophages. You can see this macrophage here is a really cool picture enveloping a yeast, a fungal yeast cell. And if you go over here, here's a drawing of what's actually going to happen to that poor little yeast cell. So these little purple things are yeast cells. And what the macrophage does, it literally just kind of envelops and closes, if you will, the yeast. And it forms this enclosed little capsule. And what's cool is the lysosome comes in and it fuses with that capsule. And it releases all of its digested enzymes, and so all that's left is just a bunch of waste particles that are released and recycled. So that's just a very general approach. It's the second level of non-specific defense. But now we need to go into a little more detail on acquired, or also known as the specific third level of defense. Now, as you can see from this chart, this is all the first and second layers of defense. Okay. Now, if we look at the specific side of the pie, we'll notice that there are two subcategories, natural and artificial. And within those, we have two sub-branches as well, active and passive. So let's start on the natural side with active. And active is essentially you getting sick. Having a virus or a bacterial infection, and so your body has to go through every single step of that layer of defense to get you healthy again. Passive, a natural passive form would be receiving immunity through breast milk. So a mom feeds her newborn, and those antibodies that are in her breast milk get passed on to the baby. On the other end of the spectrum is artificial, and we'll do active again. An active artificial way to get immunity would be, say, through a vaccine. And that vaccine gives you a dose of virus that's most likely dead or weakened, and so your body still goes through those same active steps naturally that it did naturally, but because that virus is dead, you don't get sick and you don't get those same symptoms. So it's an artificial way to induce the same types of processes. Over here, an artificial passive type of immunity would be to say you're would be like getting a dose of anti-venom. If you know you're going to be around a lot of snakes, poisonous snakes, or traveling to those types of countries, and you can get a dose of anti-venom. What it is it's actually something called antibodies, so your body doesn't have to take the time to make those on its own. In case you get that venom injected into you, you have the antidote already there. So that's a look at the specific acquired immunity, the third line of defense. What we're going to spend the most time on when we study the immune system is this natural active process. And remember, you can also subdivide this into the humoral response, the fluid response, versus the cell-mediated response. Now let me just erase all this and just give you a clean slate. Again, remember, this is the third line of defense. There is a natural and an artificial level, and within those we have active and passive. Before I wrap up everything, I want to introduce you to some major players and major terms that you need to know to understand basic immune system um, functioning. And the first are something called these little triangles on this bacterial cell, and those are called antigens. And all of our cells have antigens on them, and we can recognize those antigens as belonging to us, as self-antigens. But if something else comes into our body, say a bacteria or a virus, the antigens are not going to be the same. And so there are cells that just recognize when these antigens are not your own antigens. And so they put up a red flag, something's not right here. The next thing, very similar but opposite to antigens, are antibodies. They're these little Y-shaped things produced by special little white blood cells. And what they'll do is they'll be produced by your cells, and they'll go and they'll latch onto a matching antigen. And that kind of makes those invaders easier to see, easier to destroy. So essentially I like to call antibodies when they latch on as they're marking those cells for destruction. Now the last two pieces of the pie here that I want to introduce you to are the two main types of white blood cells that come into play. And they're both originated in the bone marrow. However, one of them actually stays and matures in the bone marrow. We call those B cells, and B cells will be associated with humoral immunity. The other type of cell which jumps ship from the bone marrow early on in development and heads over to the thymus and matures there are called T cells, and T cells will play a role in cell-mediated immunity. So that's a really basic look at how the immune system is organized. I hope that was helpful.